The Dawnbreakers, Nabal's narrative, recorded for the handicapped, tape 15. Epilogue. Never had the fortunes of the faith proclaimed by the Bab sunk to a lower ebb than when Baha'u'llah was banished from his native land to Iraq. The cause for which the Bab had given his life, for which Baha'u'llah had toiled and suffered, seemed to be on the very verge of extinction. Its force appeared to have been spent, its resistance irretrievably broken down, discouragements and disasters, each more devastating in its effect than the preceding one, had succeeded one another with bewildering rapidity, sapping its vitality and dimming the hope of its stoutest supporters. Indeed, to a superficial reader of the pages of Nabal's narrative, the whole story from its very beginning appears to be a mere recital of reverses and massacres, of humiliations and disappointments, each more severe than the previous one, culminating at last in the banishment of Baha'u'llah from his own country. To the skeptical reader, unwilling to recognize the celestial potency with which that faith was endowed, the entire conception that had evolved in the mind of its author seems to have been foredoomed to failure. The work of the Bab, so gloriously conceived, so heroically undertaken, would appear to have ended in a colossal disaster. To such a reader, the life of the ill-fated youth of Shiraz would seem, judging from the cruel blows it sustained, to be one of the saddest and most fruitless that had ever been the lot of mortal man. That short and heroic career which, swift as a meteor, flashed across the firmament of Persia and seemed for a time to have brought the longed-for light of eternal salvation into the gloom that encircled the country, was plunged at last into an abyss of darkness and despair. Every step he took, every endeavor he made, had but served to intensify the sorrows and disappointments that weighed upon his soul. The plan he had at the very outset of his career conceived of inaugurating his mission with a public proclamation in the holy cities of Mecca and Medina failed to materialize as he had hoped. The sheriff of Mecca, to whom Qudus was bidden deliver his message, accorded him a reception that betrayed, by its icy indifference, the contemptuous disregard in which the cause of a youth of Shiraz was held by the ruler of Hijaz and custodian of its Kabe. The project the Bab had in mind of returning triumphantly from his pilgrimage to the cities of Karbala and Najaf, where he hoped to establish his cause in the very heart of that stronghold of Shia orthodoxy, was likewise hopelessly shattered. The program which he had thought out, the essentials of which he had already communicated to the chosen 19 of his disciples, remained for the most part unfulfilled. The moderation he had exhorted them to observe was forgotten in the first flush of enthusiasm that seized the early missionaries of his faith, which behavior was in no small measure responsible for the failure of the hopes he had so fondly cherished. The Mu'tamid, that wise and sagacious ruler, who had so ably warded off the danger with which that precious life was threatened, and who had proved his capacity to render him services of such distinction as few of his more modest companions could have hoped to offer, was suddenly taken from him, leaving the Bab at the mercy of the perfidious Gurgin Khan, the most detestable and unscrupulous of all his enemies. The Bab's only chance of meeting Muhammad Shah, a meeting which he himself had requested and on which he had pinned his fondest hopes, was dashed to the ground by the intervention of the cowardly and capricious Haji Mirza Akazi, who trembled at the thought lest the Bab's contact with the sovereign, already unduly inclined to befriend that cause, should prove fatal to his own interests. The attempts, inspired and initiated by the Bab, which two of his foremost disciples, Mullah Ali-i Bastami and Sheikh Sayyid-i Hindi, had made to introduce the faith, the one in Turkish territory and the other in India, ended in dismal failure. The first enterprise collapsed at its very outset by reason of the cruel martyrdom of its promoter, whilst the latter was productive of what might seem a negligible result, its only fruit being the conversion of a certain Seyyid whose checkered career of service was brought to a sudden end in Luristan by the action of the treacherous Ildirim Mirza. The captivity to which the Bab himself, during the greater part of the years of his ministry, was condemned. His isolation in the mountain fastnesses of Azerbaijan from the body of his followers, who were being sorely tried by a rapacious enemy, above all the tragedy of his own martyrdom, so intense, so terribly humiliating, would appear to have marked the lowest depths of ignominy which so noble a cause, from the very hour of its birth, was doomed to suffer. His death, the culmination of a swift and stormy career, would seem to have set the seal of failure upon a task which, however heroic in the efforts it inspired, was impossible of achievement. Much as he himself had suffered, the agony he, the Bab, was made to endure was but a drop compared to the calamities which were to rain down upon the multitude of his avowed followers. The cup of sorrow that had touched his lips had yet to be drained to its very dregs by those who still remained after him. The catastrophe of Sheikh Tabasi, which robbed him of his ablest lieutenants, Qudus and Mullah Hussein, and which engulfed no less than 313 of his staunch companions, came as the cruelest blow that had yet fallen upon him, and enveloped in a shroud of darkness the closing days of his fast-ebbing life. The struggle of Neyriz, with its attendant horrors and cruelties, involving as it did the loss of Vahid, the most learned, the most influential, and the most accomplished among the followers of the Bab, was an added blow to the resources and numbers of those who continued to hold aloft the torch in their hands. The siege of Zanjan followed closely in the wake of the disaster that had befallen the faith in Neyriz, and marked by the butcheries with which the name of that province will ever remain associated, depleted still further the ranks of the upholders of the faith, and deprived them of the sustaining strength with which the presence of Hujat inspired them. With him was gone the last outstanding figure among the representative leaders of the faith who towered, by virtue of their ecclesiastical authority, their learning, their fearlessness and force of character, above the rank and file of their fellow disciples. The flower of the Bab's followers had been mown down in a ruthless carnage, leaving behind it a vast company of enslaved women and children who groaned beneath the yoke of an unrelenting foe. Their leaders, who, alike by their knowledge and example, had fed and sustained the flame that glowed in those valiant hearts, had also perished, their work seemingly abandoned amidst the confusion that afflicted a persecuted community. Of all those who had shown themselves capable of carrying on the work which the Bab had handed down to his followers, Baha'u'llah alone remained. A footnote here says, authentic tradition from Muhammad. All of them, the companions of the Qaim, shall be slain except one who shall reach the plain of Akka, the banquet hall of God. All the rest had fallen by the sword of the enemy. Mirza Yahya, the nominal leader of the band that survived the Bab, had ingloriously sought a refuge in the mountains of Mazindaran from the perils of the turmoil that had seized the capital. In the guise of a dervish, kashkul in hand, footnote here says of kashkul, an alms basket, he had deserted his companions and fled from the scene of danger to the forests of Gilan. Sayyid Hussein, the Bab's amanuensis, and Mirza Ahmad, his collaborator, who were both well versed in the teachings and implications of the newly revealed Bayan, and, by virtue of their intimacy with their master and their familiarity with the precepts of his faith, were in a position to enlighten the understanding and consolidate the foundations of the faith of their companions, in chains in the Syed Chal of Tehran, cut off entirely from the body of the believers who so greatly needed their counsel, both doomed to suffer at an early date a cruel martyrdom. Even the Bab's own maternal uncle, who, ever since his childhood, had surrounded him with a paternal solicitude that no father could have surpassed, who had rendered him signal services in the early days of his sufferings in Shiraz, and who, had he been allowed to survive him by only a few years, could have rendered inestimable services to his cause, languished in prison, forlorn and hopeless of ever continuing the work that was so close to his heart. Tahiri, that flaming emblem of his cause, who, alike by her indomitable courage Her impetuous character, her dauntless faith, her fiery ardor and vast knowledge seemed for a time able to win the whole womanhood of Persia to the cause of her beloved, fell, alas, at the very hour when victory seemed near at hand, a victim to the wrath of a calumnious enemy. The influence of her work, the course of which was so prematurely arrested, seemed to those who stood near as they lowered her into the pit that served as her grave to have been completely extinguished. The Bab's remaining letters of the living either had perished by the sword, or were fettered in prison, or again were leading an obscure life in some remote corner of the realm. The body of the Bab's voluminous writings suffered, for the most part, a fate no less humiliating than that which had befallen his disciples. Many of his copious works were utterly obliterated. Others were torn and reduced to ashes. A few were corrupted. Much was seized by the enemy, and the rest lay a mass of disorganized and undeciphered manuscripts, precariously hidden and widely scattered among the survivors of his companions. The faith the Bab had proclaimed, and for which he had given his all, had indeed reached its lowest ebb. The fires kindled against it had almost consumed the fabric upon which its continued existence depended. The wings of death seemed to be hovering above it. Extermination, complete and irremediable, appeared to be threatening its very life. Amidst the shadows that were fast gathering about it, the figure of Baha'u'llah alone shone as the potential deliverer of a cause that was fast speeding to its end. The marks of clear vision, of courage and sagacity which he had shown on more than one occasion ever since he had risen to champion the cause of the Bab, appeared to qualify him, should his life and continued existence in Persia be ensured, to revive the fortunes of an expiring faith. But this was not to be. A catastrophe unexampled in the whole history of that faith precipitated a persecution fiercer than any of that which had hitherto taken place, and this time drew into its vortex the person of Baha'u'llah himself. The slender hopes which the remnants of the believers still entertained were wrecked amidst the confusion that ensued, for Baha'u'llah, their only hope and the sole object of their confidence, was so struck down by the severity of that storm that no recovery could any longer be thought possible. After he had been despoiled of all his possessions in Nur and Tehran, denounced as the prime mover of a dastardly attempt upon the life of his sovereign, abandoned by his kindred and despised by his former friends and admirers, plunged into a dark and pestilential dungeon, and at last, with the members of his family, driven into hopeless exile beyond the confines of his native land. All the hopes that had centered round him as the possible redeemer of an afflicted faith seemed for a moment to have completely vanished. No wonder Nasir-ed-Din Shah, under whose eyes and by whose impulse such blows were being dealt, was already priding himself on being the wrecker of a cause against which he had so consistently battled, and which he had at last, to outward seeming, been able to crush. No wonder he imagined, as he sat musing over the successive stages of this vast and bloody enterprise, that by the act of banishment which his hands had signed, he was sounding the death knell of that hateful heresy which had struck such terror to the hearts of his people. To Nasir-ed-Din Shah it appeared at that supreme moment the spell of that terror was broken, but the tide that had swept over his country was at last turning and bringing back to his fellow countrymen the peace for which they cried. Now that the Bab was no more, now that the mighty pillars that sustained his cause had been crushed into dust, now that the mass of its devotees throughout the length and breadth of his dominion were cowed and exhausted, now that Baha'u'llah himself, the one remaining hope of a leaderless community, had been driven into exile and had, of his own accord, sought refuge in the neighborhood of the stronghold of Shia fanaticism, the spectre that had haunted him ever since he had ascended the throne had banished forever. Never again, he imagined, would he hear of that detestable movement which, if he were to believe his best counsellors, was swiftly receding into the shadows of impotence and oblivion. To even the followers of the faith who were left to survive the abominations heaped upon their cause, to even that small caravan, with perhaps a few exceptions, wending its way in the depth of winter through the snows of the mountains bordering on Iraq, the cause of the Bab, one can well imagine, might for a moment have seemed to have failed in accomplishing its purpose. The forces of darkness that had encompassed it on every side would seem to have at last triumphed over and put out the light which that young Prince of Glory had kindled in his land. In the eyes of Nasir-ed-Din Shah, at all events, the power that had seemed for a time to have swept within its orbit the entire forces of his realm had ceased to count. Ill-starred from its very birth, it had eventually been forced to surrender to the violence of the blows which his sword had dealt. The faith had suffered a disruption certainly well deserved. Delivered from its curse, which for many nights had robbed him of his sleep, he could now, with undivided attention, set about the task of rescuing his land from the devastating effects of that vast delusion. Henceforth, his real mission, as he conceived it, was to enable both church and state to consolidate their foundations and to reinforce their ranks against the intrusion of similar heresies which might, in a future day, poison the life of his countrymen. How vain were his imaginings, how vast his own delusion! The cause he had fondly imagined to have been crushed was still living, destined to emerge from the midst of that great convulsion stronger, purer, and nobler than ever. The cause which, to the mind of that foolish monarch, seemed to be speeding towards destruction, was but passing through the fiery tests of a phase of transition that was to carry it a step further on the path of its high destiny. A new chapter in its history was being unfolded, more glorious than any that had marked its birth or its rise. The repression which that monarch had believed to have succeeded in sealing its doom was but the initial stage in an evolution destined to blossom in the fullness of time into a revelation mightier than any that the Bab himself had proclaimed. The seed his hand had sown, though subjected for a time to the fury of a storm of unexampled violence, and though later transplanted to a foreign soil, was to continue to develop and grow in due time into a tree destined to spread its shelter over all the kindreds and peoples of the earth, though the Bab's disciples might be tortured and slain, and his companions humiliated and crushed, though his followers might dwindle in number, though the voice of the faith itself might be silenced by the arm of violence, though despair might settle upon its fortunes, though its ablest defenders might apostatize from their faith, yet the promise embedded within the shell of his word no hand could succeed in ravishing, and no power stand in the way of its germination and growth. Indeed, the first glimmerings of the dawning revelation of which the Bab had declared himself to be the herald, and to the approach and certainty of which he had so repeatedly alluded, could already be discerned amidst the gloom that encircled Baha'u'llah in the Seer Shal of Tehran. A footnote here says, "During the days when I was imprisoned in the land of Tehran, although the galling weight of chains and the loathsome atmosphere of the prison allowed me little sleep, yet occasionally, in my moments of slumber, I felt as if something were pouring forth over my breast, even as a mighty torrent which, descending from the summit of a lofty mountain, precipitates itself over the earth. All my limbs seemed to have been set aflame. At such moments my tongue recited what mortal ears could not hear." From Baha'u'llah's Epistle to the Son of the Wolf, page 17. The force that, growing out of the momentous revelation released by the Bab, was at a later time to unfold itself in all its glory and in compassed the globe was already pulsating in the veins of Baha'u'llah as he lay exposed in his cell to the sword of his executioner. The still voice which, in the hour of bitter agony, announced to the prisoner the revelation of which he was chosen to be the mouthpiece, could not of a certainty have reached the ears of the monarch, who was already preparing the celebration of the extinction of the faith his captive had championed. That imprisonment, which he who had caused, yet believed to have branded with infamy the fair name of Baha'u'llah, and which he regarded as a prelude to a still more humiliating banishment to Iraq, was indeed the very scene that witnessed the first stirrings of that movement of which Baha'u'llah was to be the author, a movement which was first to be made known in the city of Baghdad, and at a later time to be proclaimed from the prison city of Akka to the Shah, no less than to the other rulers and crowned heads of the world. Little did Nasir-ed-Din Shah imagine that by the very act of pronouncing the sentence of banishment against Baha'u'llah, he was helping in the unfolding of God's irrepressible purpose, and that he himself was but an instrument in the execution of that design. Little did he imagine that as his reign was drawing to a close, it would witness a revival of the very forces he had sought so strenuously to exterminate, a revival that would manifest a vitality such as he, in the hour of darkest despair, had never believed that faith to possess. Not only within the confines of his own realm, not only throughout the adjacent territories of Iraq and Russia, but as far as India in the east, as far as Egypt and European Turkey in the west, a recrudescence of the faith such as he had never expected awakened him from the dreams in which he had so fondly indulged. The cause of the Bab seemed as if risen from the dead. It appeared under a form infinitely more formidable than any under which it had appeared in the past. The fresh impetus which, despite his calculations, the personality of Baha'u'llah, and, above all, the inherent strength of the revelation which he personified, had lent to the cause of the Bab, was one Nasir-ed-Din Shah had never imagined. The rapidity with which a slumbering faith had been revived and consolidated within his own territory, its spreading out to states beyond its confines, the stupendous claims advanced by Baha'u'llah almost in the midst of the stronghold where he had chosen to dwell, the public declaration of that claim in European Turkey, and its proclamation in challenging epistles to the crowned heads of the earth, one of which the Shah himself was destined to receive, the enthusiasm that announcement evoked in the hearts of countless followers, the transference to the Holy Land of the center of his cause, the gradual relaxation of the severity of his confinement which marked the closing days of his life, the lifting of the ban that had been imposed by the Sultan of Turkey on his intercourse with visitors and pilgrims who flocked from various parts of the East to his prison, the awakening of the spirit of inquiry among the thinkers of the West, the utter disruption of the forces that had attempted to effect a schism in the ranks of his followers, and the fate that had befallen its chief instigator, above all, the sublimity of those teachings with which his published works abounded, and which were being read, disseminated, and taught by an ever-increasing number of adherents in Russian Turkestan, in Iraq, in India, in Syria, and as far off as European Turkey. These were among the chief factors that convincingly revealed to the eyes of the Shah the invincible character of a faith he believed himself to have bridled and destroyed. The futility of his efforts, however, much as he might attempt to conceal his feelings, was only too apparent. The cause of the Bab, the birth and tribulations of which he himself had witnessed, and the triumphant progress of which he was now beholding, had risen phoenix-like from its ashes, and was pressing forward along the road leading to undreamed-of achievements. Little did Nabil himself imagine that within 20 years of the writing of his narrative, the revelation of Baha'u'llah, the flower and fruit of all the dispensations of the past, would have been capable of advancing thus far on the road leading to its worldwide recognition and triumph. Little did he imagine that less than 40 years after the death of Baha'u'llah, his cause, bursting beyond the confines of Persia and the East, would have penetrated the furthermost regions of the globe and would have encircled the whole earth. Scarcely would he have believed the prediction had he been told that the cause would, within that period, have implanted its banner in the heart of the American continent, would have made itself felt in the leading capitals of Europe, would have reached out to the southern confines of Africa, and would have established its outpost as far as Australasia. Hardly would his imagination, fired as it was by a conviction as to the destiny of his faith, have carried him to a point at which he could have pictured to his mind the tomb shrine of the Bab, of the ultimate destination of whose remains he confesses himself to be ignorant, embosomed in the heart of Carmel, a place of pilgrimage and a beacon of light to many a visitor from the ends of the earth. Hardly could he have imagined that the humble dwelling of Baha'u'llah, lost amid the tortuous lanes of old Baghdad, would one day, as a result of the machinations of a tireless enemy, have forced itself on the attention and become the object of the earnest deliberations of the assembled representatives of the leading powers of Europe. Little did he imagine that, with all the praise he, in his narrative, lavishes upon him, there would proceed from the most great branch, Abdu'l-Baha's title, a power that within a short period would have awakened the northern states of the American continent to the glory of the revelation bequeathed to him by Baha'u'llah. Little did he imagine that the dynasties of those monarchs, the evidences of whose tyranny he recounts so vividly in his narrative, would have tottered to their fall, suffered the very fate which their representatives had so desperately striven to inflict upon their dreaded opponents. Little did he imagine that the whole ecclesiastical hierarchy of his country, the prime mover and the willing instrument of the abominations heaped upon his faith, would so swiftly and easily be overthrown by the very forces it had attempted to subdue. Never would he have believed that the highest institutions of Sunni Islam, the Sultanate and the Caliphate, those twin oppressors of the faith of Baha'u'llah, would have been swept away so ruthlessly by the very hands of the professing adherents of the faith of Islam. Little did he imagine that side by side with the steady expansion of the cause of Baha'u'llah, the forces of consolidation and internal administration would so progress as to present to the world the unique spectacle of a commonwealth of peoples, worldwide in its ramifications, united in its purpose, coordinated in its efforts, and fired by a zeal and enthusiasm that no amount of adversity can quench. And yet, who knows what achievements, greater than any that the past and the present have witnessed, may not still be in store for those into whose hands so precious a heritage has been entrusted. Who knows but that out of the turmoil which agitates the face of present-day society, there may not emerge, sooner than we expect, the world order of Baha'u'llah, the bare outline of which is being but faintly discerned among the world-wide communities that bear his name. For, great and marvelous as have been the achievements of the past, the glory of the golden age of the cause, whose promise lies embedded within the shell of Baha'u'llah's immortal utterance, is yet to be revealed. Fierce as may seem the onslaught of the forces of darkness that may still afflict this cause, desperate and prolonged as may be that struggle, severe as may be the disappointments it may still experience, the ascendancy it will eventually obtain will be such as no other faith has ever in its history achieved. The welding of the communities of East and West into a world-wide brotherhood of which poets and dreamers have sung, and the promise of which lies at the very core of the revelation conceived by Baha'u'llah, the recognition of his law as the indissoluble bond uniting the peoples and nations of the earth, and the proclamation of the reign of the most great peace are but a few among the chapters of the glorious tale which the consummation of the faith of Baha'u'llah will unfold. Who knows but that triumphs unsurpassed in splendor are not in store for the mass of Baha'u'llah's toiling followers? Surely we stand too near the colossal edifice his hand has reared to be able, at the present stage of the evolution of his revelation, to claim, even to conceive the full measure of its promised glory. Its past history, stained by the blood of countless martyrs, may well inspire us with the thought that whatever may yet befall this cause, however formidable the forces that may still assail it, however numerous the reverses it will inevitably suffer, its onward march can never be stayed, and that it will continue to advance until the very last promise, enshrined within the words of Baha'u'llah, shall have been completely redeemed. Baha'u'llah's tribute to the Bab and his chief disciples. Extracts from the Kitab-i-Iqan. Though young and tender of age, and though the cause he revealed was contrary to the desire of all the peoples of the earth, both high and low, rich and poor, exalted and abased, king and subject, yet he arose and steadfastly proclaimed it. All have known and heard this. He feared no one. He was reckless of consequences. Could such a thing be made manifest except through the power of a divine revelation and the potency of God's invincible will? By the righteousness of God, were anyone to entertain so great a revelation in his heart, the thought of such a declaration would alone confound him. For the hearts of all men to be crowded into his heart, he would still hesitate to venture upon so awful an enterprise. He could achieve it only by the permission of God, only if the channel of his heart were to be linked with the source of divine grace, and his soul be assured of the unfailing sustenance of the Almighty. To what, we wonder, do they ascribe so great a daring? Do they accuse him of madness, as they accused the prophets of old? Or do they maintain that his motive was none other than leadership and the acquisition of earthly riches? Gracious God, in his book, which he hath entitled Qiyumul Azma, the first, the greatest, and mightiest of all books, he prophesied his own martyrdom. In it is this passage: O thou remnant of God, I have sacrificed myself wholly for thee. I have accepted curses for thy sake, and have yearned for naught but martyrdom in the path of thy love. Sufficient witness unto me is God, the exalted, the protector, the ancient of days. Could the revealer of such utterance be regarded as walking in any other way than the way of God, and as having yearned for aught else except his good pleasure? In this very verse there lieth concealed a breath of detachment for which, if it were breathed upon the world, all beings would renounce their life and sacrifice their soul. And now consider how this Sadri of the Rizvan of God hath in the prime of youth risen to proclaim the cause of God. Behold, what steadfastness he, the beauty of God, hath revealed. The whole world rose to hinder him, yet it utterly failed. The more severe the persecution they inflicted on that Sadri of blessedness, the more his fervour increased, and the brighter burned the flame of his love. All this is evident, and none disputeth its truth. Finally, he surrendered his soul and winged his flight unto the realms above. No sooner had that eternal beauty revealed himself in Shiraz, in the year 60, and rent asunder the veil of concealment from the signs of the ascendancy, the might, the sovereignty, and power emanating from that essence of essences and sea of seas were manifest in the land, so much so that from every city there appeared the signs, the evidences, the tokens and testimonies of that divine luminary. How many were those pure and kindly hearts which faithfully reflected the light of that eternal sun, and how manifold the emanations of knowledge from that ocean of divine wisdom which encompassed all beings. In every city all the divines and nobles rose to hinder and repress them, and girded up the loins of malice, of envy and tyranny for their suppression. How great the number of those holy souls, those essence of justice, who, accused of tyranny, were put to death, and how many embodiments of purity, who showed forth naught but true knowledge and stainless deeds, suffered an agonizing death. Notwithstanding all this, each of these holy beings, up to his last moment, breathed the name of God and soared in the realm of submission and resignation. Such was the potency and transmuting influence which he exercised over them, that they ceased to cherish any desire but his will, and wedded their souls to his remembrance. Reflect, who in the world is able to manifest such transcendent power, such pervading influence? All these stainless hearts and sanctified souls have with absolute resignation responded to the summons of his decree. Instead of making complaint, they rendered thanks unto God, and amidst the darkness of their anguish they revealed naught but radiant acquiescence in his will. It is well known how relentless was the hate, how bitter the malice and enmity entertained by all the peoples of the earth towards these companions. The persecution and pain which they inflicted on these holy and spiritual beings were regarded by them as means unto salvation, prosperity, and everlasting success. Hath the world, since the days of Adam, witnessed such tumult, such violent commotion? Notwithstanding all the torture they suffered, and the manifold afflictions they endured, they became the object of universal opprobrium and execration. Methinks patience was revealed only by virtue of their fortitude, and faithfulness itself was begotten by their deeds. Do thou ponder these momentous happenings in thine heart, so that thou mayest apprehend the greatness of this revelation, and perceive its stupendous glory. And finally, here is the glossary, giving the meanings of the Persian and Arabic words used throughout this book. Abba, cloak or mantle. Azan, Muslim call to prayer. A.H., after Hijrah, date of Muhammad's migration from Mecca to Medina, and basis of Muhammadan chronology. Akbar, greater. Amir, lord, prince, commander, governor. Aqa, master, title given by Baha'u'llah to Abdul-Baha. Azam, the greatest. Bab, gate, title assumed by Mirza Ali Muhammad after the declaration of his mission in Shiraz in May AD 1844. Baha, glory, splendor, light, title by which Baha'u'llah, Mirza Hussein Ali, is designated. Baqiyatullah, remnant of God, title applied both to the Bab and to Baha'u'llah. Bayan, utterance, explanation, title given by the Bab to his revelation, particularly to his books. Big, honorary title, lower title than Khan. Caravanserai, an inn for caravans. Daruqi, high constable. Dawle, state, government. Farman, order, command, royal decree. Farash, footman, lictor, attendant. Farash Bashi, the head Farash. Farsakh, unit of measurement. Its length differs in different parts of the country according to the nature of the ground, the local interpretation of the term being the distance which a laden mule will walk in the hour, which varies from 3 to 4 miles. Arabicized from the Old Persian parsang, and supposed to be derived from pieces of stone, sang, placed on the roadside. Haji, a Mohammedan who has performed the pilgrimage to Mecca. Howdah, a litter carried by a camel, mule, horse, or elephant for travelling purposes. Il, clan. Imam, title of the 12 Shia successors of Muhammad, also applied to Muslim religious leaders. Imam Jumi, the leading imam in a town or city, chief of the mullahs. Imam Zadeh, descendant of an imam or his shrine. Jube, an upper coat. Kabe, ancient shrine at Mecca, now recognized as the most holy shrine of Islam. Qad Quda, chief of a ward or parish of a town, headman of a village. Kalantar, mayor. Kalim, one who discourses. Karbilai, a Mohammedan who has performed the pilgrimage to Karbila. Khan, prince, lord, nobleman, chieftain. Kula, a Persian lambskin hat worn by government employees and civilians. Madrisse, religious college. Man yuzhiruhullah, he whom God will make manifest, title given by the Bab to the Promised One. Mashhadi, a Mohammedan who has performed the pilgrimage to Mashhad. Masjid, mosque, temple, place of worship. Maidan, a subdivision of a farsakh, a square or open place. Mihdi, title of the manifestation expected by Islam. Mihrab, the principal place of a mosque where the imam prays with his face turned towards Mecca. Miraj, ascent, used with reference to Muhammad's ascension to heaven. Mirza, a contraction of Amir Zadi, meaning son of Amir. When affixed to a name, it signifies prince. When prefixed, simply Mr. Muazzin, one who sounds the Ajan, the Mohammedan call to prayer. Mujtahid, Mohammedan doctor of law. Most of the Mujtahids of Persia have received their diplomas from the most eminent jurists of Karbila and Najaf. Mullah, Mohammedan priest. Mustaqaf, he who is invoked, the numerical value of which has been assigned by the Bab as the limit to the time fixed for the advent of the promised manifestation. Nabil, learned, noble. Nowruz, new day, name applied to the Baha'i New Year's Day, according to the Persian calendar, the day on which the sun enters Aries. Nukti, point. Pahlavan, athlete, champion, term applied to brave and muscular men. Qadi, judge, civil, criminal, and ecclesiastical. Qaim, he who shall arise, title designating the promised one of Islam. Kalyan, a pipe for smoking through water. Qibla, the direction to which people turn in prayer, especially Mecca, the Qibla of all Mohammedans. Qurban, sacrifice. Sahibuz Saman, Lord of the Age, one of the titles of the promised Qaim. Shahid, martyr, the plural is Shuhada. Sheikhul Islam, head of religious court appointed to every large city by the Shah. Sayyid, descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. Suri, name of the chapters of the Quran. Tuman, a sum of money equivalent to $1. Vali Ad, heir to the throne, and Zadi, son. That is the end of the Dawnbreakers, Nabil's narrative.